Crimson liquid dripped from the Zanari's gaping wound as its life force ebbed away, abandoned by the Galactic Council to face genocide alone, until it called upon humanity's lethal skill to fight back. Kyle Collins, grizzled ex-Marine turned mercenary, slouched in a dimly lit booth at the CDZX Tango Bar on the ass end of Zeta Station. Smoke and shady deals hung thick in the air. His contact was late. He drummed armored fingers on the table, other hand resting on his holstered FK-90 sidearm. "You came," a hoarse, panicked voice rasped. A cloaked figure furtively slipped into the seat across from Kyle. Trembling grey hands pushed back its hood, revealing a gaunt, scarred Zanari face. The alien's bulbous eyes darted around in terror. "I'm Sci-Fi. My people are being slaughtered. Dozens of our colonies wiped out. No survivors, only mountains of corpses. Strange wounds." The Zanari shuddered. "The Council won't help. We have no army, no defenses. You must investigate before we're exterminated." Kyle snorted derisively. "Sounds like a you problem. Deal with it yourself." "Please, we'll pay anything," Sire-Father begged. Kyle leaned forward, interest piqued. "How much we talking?" The bar door crashed open. 3 hulking insectoid Zoraks stormed in, compound eyes locked on Sire-Father. The Zanari bolted for the back. "Shit!" Kyle smoothly drew his sidearm and put 3 disruptor bolts through the Zoraks' heads. Sizzling husks thudded to the floor. In the alley, Sire-Father babbled in fear. "Zorak assassins, they'll never stop hunting me. Someone wants to keep the Zanari from getting help." Kyle sighed in annoyance. This was bigger than he'd thought, but the payday... "Fine, I'm in, but I'm tripling my price. We're going to get to the bottom of what's killing your kind." Kyle's shuttle touched down at the edge of the Zanari colony, kicking up swirls of ashy dust. An oppressive silence hung over the abandoned settlement, broken only by the shuttle's hissing hydraulics as the hatch cracked open. Kyle and Sire-Father stepped out, weapons at the ready. The colony street stretched before them, lifeless and still, no signs of activity, no sounds of inhabitants, only an eerie, unnatural quiet. As they cautiously picked their way through the deserted streets, Kyle's eyes caught on strange splatters, staining the walls, and pooled on the ground, viscous and green, like some kind of alien ichor. He knelt down, examining the substance. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, a sick feeling rising in his gut. Sire-Father said nothing, his face a mask of dread. They followed the trail of green, winding deeper into the colony's heart, and there, in a central square, they found them. Dozens of Zanari corpses, piled haphazardly like discarded dolls. Kyle approached slowly, his grip tightening on his rifle. The bodies were shriveled husks, drained of all fluids. Each bore a single puncture at the base of the skull, neat and precise. A chill crawled up his spine. Suddenly, a faint thumping echoed from a nearby building. Kyle's head snapped around, his rifle jumping to his shoulder. Sire-Father fumbled for his own weapon, hands shaking. Hearts pounding, they approached the building. The thumping grew louder. Steadying himself, Kyle kicked in the door, sweeping the room with his rifle. There, barricaded in a corner, they found her. A lone Zanari female clutching a plasma rifle in trembling hands. She was badly wounded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Kyle lowered his weapon slightly. "It's okay," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "We're here to help. What's your name?" "Sarah," she rasped, her eyes wide and haunted. You have to get out of here. They'll be coming. They'll be coming." Sire-Father knelt beside her, his voice urgent. "What happened here, Zara? What came?" Zara shuddered, her words spilling out in a panicked rush. She spoke of creatures, insectoid horrors that burst from the vents. They swarmed over walls and ceilings, moving too fast to follow. They overwhelmed the colonists, latching onto their skulls, piercing through bone with long needle-like proboscises, killing in seconds. As Kyle listened, his blood ran cold. He'd seen a lot of shit in his days, but this... A skittering sound filled the room, echoing from within the walls. Kyle and Sire-Father froze, exchanging a look of pure terror. The creatures were here. They knew. "We have to move now," Kyle barked, yanking Zara to her feet. Sci-Fi needed no encouragement, already bolting for the door. They ran, tearing through the colony streets as a rising chittering swelled behind them. Kyle risked a glance back and immediately wished he hadn't. A tide of glittering insectoid bodies poured from the buildings, skittering towards them with horrifying speed. The hangar loomed ahead, their only hope. They sprinted up the ramp of the nearest shuttle, Kyle slamming the controls to raise it. The chittering tide swarmed the hangar, throwing themselves at the rising ramp. Kyle watched in horror as the metal began to buckle and deform under the onslaught. "Punch it!" he roared, and Sci-Fi fired the thrusters. The shuttle blasted free of the hangar, the swarm spilling off its hull as they rocketed into the sky. Kyle slumped against the wall, his heart racing. Zara had collapsed into a seat, her eyes glazed and distant. Sci-Fi's hands shook on the controls. As the shuttle breached atmosphere, Kyle managed to gather himself. He stumbled to the cockpit, bringing up the navigational controls. "Set a course for this location," he said, his voice grim. "It's a black site run by my outfit. Whatever the hell those things are, they're not taking us down yet." The shuttle banked hard, accelerating into the void. Behind them, the Zanari colony dwindled to a dark blot on the planet's surface. But Kyle knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was far from over. Those creatures, whatever they were, they had a taste for Zanari blood now. And something told him they wouldn't stop until they'd had their fill. The shuttle shuddered as it docked with the mercenary space station. No sooner had the airlock hissed open than Kyle and Sci-Fi were dragging Zara's limp form through the corridors, shouting for a medic. They burst into the infirmary, startling the duty nurse. She took one look at Zara's pallid face and bleeding wounds and snapped into action, calling for backup as she grabbed a scanner. Kyle stepped back, letting the medics swarm around Zara. He pulled out his comms unit with a shaking hand and punched in a code. A moment later, a grizzled face filled the screen. "Collins, what the hell is going on?" Commander Axton barked. Kyle took a deep breath. "Sir, we've got a situation. The Zanari colonies, they're being wiped out, some kind of creature." As he relayed the horrifying details, he watched Axton's face grow darker and darker. When Kyle finished, Axton was silent for a long moment. "Lock down the station," he said finally, his voice grim. "No one in or out until we know what we're dealing with." Sirens began to wail as Axton issued the order. He fixed Kyle with a hard stare. "You're not the first, Collins. We've had other teams encounter these things, but none of them made it back to give us the full story." Kyle's blood ran cold. How widespread was this? Axton was still talking. "I'm sending a team to analyze the wounds in that green shit you mentioned. Report to briefing room A in 10. The screen went dark. Kyle looked up to see Sci-Fi watching him, his face etched with worry. In the briefing room, they found a haggard man waiting for them. He had the look of someone who hadn't slept in days, his eyes shadowed and his clothes rumpled. "Dr. Elias Richter," he introduced himself, his voice hoarse. "Xenobiologist, I've been tracking these creatures for months." He tapped a button, and a holographic image sprang to life above the table. It was one of the creatures from the colony, its insectoid body glistening with menace. "Highly evolved parasites," Richter said. "They need biological matter from other species to reproduce. The more hosts they infect, the faster they spread." His face was grave. "I believe someone is deliberately distributing them to certain planets and colonies, targeting them." Kyle opened his mouth to ask who would do such a thing, but he was cut off by a blaring alarm. Richter's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "They're here," he whispered. "Containment breach." Kyle was already moving, Sci-Fi on his heels. They sprinted for the armory, alarms screaming in their ears. Axton was already there, barking orders as his men grabbed weapons and armor. Kyle snatched a pulse rifle from a rack, checking the charge. The doors burst open, and Zara stumbled through, her face pale but determined. Medigel gleamed on her freshly sealed wounds. "I'm fighting," she growled, grabbing a rifle of her own. "Those bastards killed my people. I'm not hiding." Kyle met her eyes and nodded. Around them, the ragtag group readied their weapons. Mercenaries, a scientist, a revenge-driven survivor, united against a common horror. Richter's voice echoed in Kyle's mind as they moved to the doors, deliberately spreading the creatures. But who? And why? There was no time to ponder it further. The doors slid open, revealing a corridor writhing with skittering chitinous bodies. The swarm had come. Kyle raised his rifle and fired, the first of many shots to come. The battle for the station, for their very survival, had begun. Kyle fired into the chittering swarm, pulse rounds ripping through insectoid bodies, but for every creature that fell, two more seemed to take its place, skittering forward with single-minded purpose. The swarm adapted before their eyes, carapaces thickening, movements becoming more erratic and harder to predict. "We can't keep this up," Sci-Fi shouted over the din of gunfire and skittering. "They're learning too fast." Dr. Richter ducked as a creature leapt at his head, its proboscis extending hungrily. "The hive mind! We need to disrupt their communication, break the pattern." Kyle gritted his teeth, ejecting a spent power cell. "The central computer core, can you access it from there, find a weakness?" Richter nodded, his face pale but determined. "I can try, but we'll have to fight our way there." Zara stepped forward, her plasma rifle humming with deadly intent. "Then that's what we'll do." The team pushed forward, inch by blood-soaked inch. The corridors were a nightmare of skittering bodies and flashing claws, the very walls seeming to come alive with the seething mass of the swarm. They fought with desperate fury, Zara's battle cries ringing out as she charged into the thick of the fray, Kyle and Sci-Fi laying down covering fire. At last they reached the central core, the doors slamming shut behind them, but what awaited them was no refuge. A massive, pulsating structure dominated the chamber, a grotesque parody of a hive. It throbbed with sickly green light, tendrils snaking out to probe the surrounding consoles, and before it, a figure stood, silhouetted against the eerie glow. "Axton," Kyle breathed, his rifle lowering a fraction. "What the hell are you doing here?" The figure turned, and Kyle recoiled. It was Axton, but not the commander he knew. The man's eyes were glazed, his movements jerky and unnatural. When he spoke, his voice echoed with 1,000 chittering undertones. "Kyle, I had hoped you would understand, that you would join us willingly." Sci-Fi made a choking sound. "Join you? You're infected. You're one of them." Axton spread his hands, a grotesque smile stretching his features. "No, I am them and they are me. We are one, a perfect union of flesh and will, the future of the galaxy." Kyle felt sick, his grip tightening on his rifle. "The Zenari, all those colonies, it was you. You're spreading these things." "The Zenari were just the beginning," Axton said, his tone almost pitying. "A test to perfect the process. We have agents on 100 worlds, in the very heart of the Galactic Council. When the signal comes, when the hive mind reaches critical mass, a new order will rise." Zara snarled, her eyes flashing with hate. "You monster, we'll stop you, we'll burn your hive to ash." Axton shook his head. "You still don't understand. There is no stopping us, only submission or oblivion." He took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Join us, Kyle. Take your place in the new world or die with the old one." Kyle looked to his team, saw the determination in their eyes, the readiness to fight to the last. He raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at Axton's head. "We'll take oblivion, thanks." Zara charged, a scream of pure fury on her lips. Sci-Fi and Dr. Richter flanked her, weapons blazing, and Kyle, he centered his sights on the creature that had once been his friend, his commander, and fired. The battle for the station, for the future of the galaxy, had reached its inevitable climax, and as the swarm surged forward to meet them, Kyle knew only one thing for certain. One way or another, this ended here. The swarm pressed in from all sides, a chittering tide of horror that threatened to engulf them. Kyle, Sci-Fi, Zara, and Dr. Richter fought with desperate fury, pulse rounds and plasma bolts searing through the air. But for every creature that fell, a dozen more took its place, skittering forward with relentless purpose. "We need to reach the reactor core," Dr. Richter shouted over the din of battle, his face streaked with sweat and gore. "It's our only chance." They pushed forward, inch by bloody inch, the corridors a nightmare of flashing claws and gnashing jaws. Kyle's rifle clicked empty, and he switched to his sidearm, blasting a creature off Sci-Fi's back. Zara was a whirlwind of destruction, her plasma rifle leaving glowing scars in the walls. Suddenly, Dr. Richter let out a triumphant shout. "The frequency, I've isolated it." He held up his scanner, the screen flashing with a complex waveform. "If we can broadcast this through the station's systems, it should disrupt the hive mind's control." "Then let's get to the reactor," Kyle barked. "We can overload the core, send out an EMP pulse, fry these bastards for good." They redoubled their efforts, fighting with renewed purpose. But the swarm seemed to sense their intent, and the assault intensified. Creatures poured from the vents, dropping from the ceiling, bursting through the walls. A scream tore through the chaos. Kyle whirled to see Zara, her rifle torn from her grasp, being dragged into the shadows by a mass of creatures. He lunged for her, fingers straining, but Sci-Fi hauled him back. "No, Kyle, it's too late. We have to go." Kyle struggled against Sci-Fi's grip, watching in helpless horror as Zara disappeared into the writhing swarm. Her screams cut off abruptly, leaving a terrible silence in their wake. With heavy hearts they pressed on, the loss of their comrade a bitter weight in their chests. They would honor her sacrifice. They had to. At last they reached the reactor core, the massive chamber thrumming with barely contained energy. But as they approached the control console, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was Axton, but not the man they knew. His flesh was a mottled patchwork, his eyes replaced by glowing insectoid orbs. He moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, flanked by a host of similarly infected mercenaries. "You cannot stop us," Axton hissed, his voice a discordant buzz. "We are Legion, we are the future." Kyle and Sci-Fi opened fire, the air thick with the stench of burning chitin. The infected mercenaries surged forward, their movements erratic and hard to predict. Pulse rounds tore through flesh and bone, but the creatures barely slowed. Dr. Richter hunched over the control console, his fingers flying over the keys. "Almost there," he muttered, sweat beading his brow. "Just a little longer." The creatures were on them now, a press of bodies and slashing claws. Kyle felt searing pain as a talon raked across his back, but he gritted his teeth and kept firing. Beside him, Sci-Fi fought with the strength of desperation, his rifle butt smashing into chitinous faces. Just as it seemed they would be overwhelmed, Dr. Richter let out a shout of triumph. "It's done, the overload sequence is initiated." But his victory was short-lived. A creature leapt from the shadows, its proboscis punching clean through Dr. Richter's chest. The scientist crumpled, his scanner clattering to the floor. "Richter!" Kyle shouted, but there was no time to mourn. The station shuddered around them, alarms blaring as the reactor began to destabilize. "We have to go now," Sci-Fi yelled, grabbing Kyle's arm. They ran, leaving the creatures and the fallen behind. The station was coming apart, bulkheads buckling, pipes bursting. They barely made it to the escape pods, hurling themselves inside just as the deck gave way beneath them. The pods jettisoned, rocketing away from the doomed station. Behind them the reactor went critical, a blinding flash of light that consumed the swarm and the hive mind that controlled them. An EMP pulse rippled outward, frying circuitry and neural pathways alike. In the silence that followed, Kyle and Sci-Fi could only watch as the station broke apart, the wreckage drifting in the void. The galaxy was saved, but the cost had been high. Too high. In the weeks that followed, the Galactic Council lauded them as heroes, saviors of the galaxy. But the praise rang hollow in their ears. They had lost friends, comrades. They had seen horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their days. Sci-Fi announced his intention to return to the Zenari homeworld, to rebuild what had been lost. to forge a new future for his people, one free from the spectre of annihilation. Kyle couldn't face that future. Not yet. The wounds were too raw, the memories too fresh. He needed time, space, a chance to come to terms with all that had happened. And so he disappeared, fading into the fringes of the galaxy, a ghost haunted by the ghosts of those he couldn't save. The scars of the battle would fade in time, but some scars Kyle knew were carved into the very soul. Those scars he would carry forever. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.